Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for choosing to spend some time with us today as we open up another chapter of our Jewish history at Beyond the Perimeter, Jews Outside of Winnipeg. We're playing with house money. It's really nice out, so it's nice to see so many people here today. I don't know how many more days like this we're going to have, but we'll enjoy them while we can. Before we get going today, it's important for the Jewish Heritage Centre of Western Canada to acknowledge that the province of Manitoba is located on the territories of Treaties 1 through 5 and on the ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the national homeland of the Red River Métis. We respect and honor the treaties and agreements that were made on these lands we share, and we remain committed to strengthening our relationships with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Harlan Abels. I am the president of the Jewish Heritage Centre of Western Canada, and I've been given the pleasure of bringing greetings from our organization this afternoon. I usually like to give a little bit of an introduction about the program, but I'll be honest, I actually don't know anything about this one. I sat in the crowd just like all of you last year at the Kenora Kainahora and learned all about the early Jewish roots in the Lake of the Woods region. And I'm excited to follow it up today and learn about Portage Prairie, Selkirk, Brandon, and Esterhazy, Saskatchewan. I know our panelists have done excellent research, and I can't wait to hear what they're going to share with us. So without further ado, thank you again for being here, and I'd like to pass on to Dan to continue today's proceedings. Thanks, guys.
As you can tell, one of the aims of any program is to see how many people you can get up here, and also to see how quickly they can get off. I'll do my best. As Harlan said, program Beyond the Perimeter, exploring the lives and cultural activities of Jews in small centers in Manitoba and Saskatchewan. This program is of particular personal interest to me since my father was born in a small town in Wisconsin, where his father owned the general store. The experience that he had was, of course, the subject of many family stories. They left after about 15 years and moved to New York, where there were, as you can imagine, a somewhat larger Jewish community. So I'll be very interested to hear what the differences were between these four centers that are in discussion today and my own family experience with a wide spread of years, of course. The moderator of the program will be Chana Tao. She will introduce the speakers one at a time as they speak, and then conduct a question-answer period. So after the speakers speak, there'll be an opportunity to make comments from your own experience or family experience, and also, of course, to ask questions of the speakers. After the program concludes, there will be some refreshments served in the social hall downstairs. For those of you who are not familiar with the building, there are washrooms downstairs. There's also around the corner here from the hall. Chana is a Winnipegger, not from one of the four major centers that are discussed today. Her career has been quite varied. She did French translation for the federal government. She's done freelance Hebrew and Yiddish translation, most notably a section of the book Found Treasures, stories by Yiddish women's writers, where she translated from the Yiddish. Later on, she conducted classes at Age and Opportunity and other places on writing life histories for seniors, some of which they pursued afterwards and have were published primarily for family use. This brought Chana into the process of collecting stories herself, and she conducted many oral history projects for the Jewish Heritage Center, one of which just happened to be, as it turned out, on growing up Jewish in smaller centers in Manitoba and Saskatchewan. She conducted 33 interviews and then put them together in an essay entitled Growing Up Jewish on the Prairies, Rural Manitoba and Saskatchewan, which won the 2010 Switzer Cooperstock Prize for the best essay submitted in the 2-year period. After that, coincidentally, the first prize in the first year of existence was on the Lipton Colony. So Chana is conversant with these things, and I'll turn the program over to you, Chana. You can start there, or
I'll stand. Thank you, Dan. It's good to see everybody here. And for me, it's just reviewing a little bit of what I did, except that after that project, people came out of the woodwork, both in the audience and after, saying, oh, we have stories, which we didn't know about at the time. So it's really nice to be here and here's two of them. I had interviewed Lil before, and I'd interviewed Sid, but we got two new ones. So I will just give you a wee bit of background, and then the speakers. The Jewish population of Winnipeg right now is almost entirely in Winnipeg. Many Jews, especially younger ones, know nothing of the days when Jews lived on farms and small towns throughout the region. Yet a surprising number of Winnipeggers have their roots beyond the perimeter, highway that is, in Manitoba and Saskatchewan. They remember their origins vividly and for the most part fondly. Jews began coming to Canada, to the prairies, in the late 1800s. Farm colonies were established with the assistance of the Jewish Colonization Association in Saskatchewan, there were settlements at Moosomin, which was called New Jerusalem, and Wapella, and later at Sonnenfeld, Edenbridge, and Hirsch, near Estevan. In Manitoba, there were colonies at Camper, which was called New Hirsch, and Bender Hamlet, near Narcisse. And it was called Hirsch because Baron Hirsch was providing money to get those settlements started. The Russian immigrants who came to escape persecution and pogroms in Tsarist Russia. Others came to escape compulsory conscription or poor economic or social conditions in their country of origin. Whether they had any experience with farming or not, they came and said they did in response to the government's offers of free land and freedom in Canada, or because they were encouraged by relatives and friends who had already come here. Jewish settlement in Canada was not undertaken in pursuit of ideological goals. The JCA, the Colonization Association, assisted settlers because it believed that shifting the emphasis of Jewish life from trade to agriculture would reduce anti-Semitism among Gentiles. Imagine their dismay when they arrived and found heavily forested land that required clearing in order to build primitive houses and plant crops. The late 1880s were marked by the arrival of the railway on the prairies. The CPR set up stations every 6 to 8 miles, which became the nuclei of towns. Next would come the grain elevator and the country store, as often as not owned and operated by a Jewish storekeeper. There were several reasons for this. Many Jews had entrepreneurial backgrounds. Also, they could speak the many languages of the farmers, Russian, Ukrainian, Polish, and German. And I came across one man who had learned Cree in order to communicate with his clientele. Not only was the Jewish merchant adaptable and hardworking, but to quote one source, perhaps his most important contribution was the Institute of Credit. The fact that Jewish merchants were generally sensitive to social circumstances and would extend credit and help customer families contributed to their success. Rabbi Arthur Cheel, in his book, The Jews of Manitoba, states that at the height of the rural Jewish population in the 1920s, Jewish country merchants could be found in at least 118 towns and villages of Manitoba, where they spent from 10 to 20 years. As country merchants, they were more than mere storekeepers. They served as interpreters, counselors, and trusted friends, and their stores became informal gathering places, institutions of friendship. These associations led to rich mutual loyalties between storekeeper and customer. Louis Rosenberg, Western manager of the Jewish Colonization Association of Canada, wrote the same about Saskatchewan, and I'm quoting him now. Without the Jewish storekeeper, Saskatchewan could not have developed as it did. Every 8 miles, there was a stop. The train came twice a week and brought passengers, brought in produce, and took away produce and cattle. The Jewish storekeeper was usually the letter writing for the immigrant homesteaders. He ordered the goods from Eaton's for them, he carried them, he gave them credit until the fall. Kashrut, keeping kosher, was a difficult issue. Many families tried to keep kosher when they first moved to the towns, but gave up when the meat would arrive spoiled. The closer a family lived to a larger Jewish center or city, the easier it was for them to keep kosher, as this entailed getting the meat from the city, usually Winnipeg. For storekeepers and farmers, strict observance of Shabbat was usually impossible, because Saturday was the big day, although many lit candles and still had special meals and challah. Ultimately, most rural Jewish families moved into the city by the 1950s, most frequently into Winnipeg, for the same reason that the earlier farm colonies had ceased to exist. At, I quote, the inability to ensure Jewish culture, religion, and the need for higher education for children. Many of those who had very little Jewish content in their rural lives, interestingly, sought it out and acquired it when they moved into Winnipeg. Also, many members of the second generation and the third became professionals and had an impact on the development of Winnipeg's Jewish and general communities. Most of the interviewees, when asked how they felt growing up Jewish in small towns on the prairies had affected their later lives, expressed the sentiment that it gave them a broader outlook. So that's just a bit of a nutshell of background, and I'm very pleased that we are now going to get some updates and additional information. I'll start by introducing David Greenberg. David grew up in Portage la Prairie. He has practiced law there since 1966 when he joined his father's law firm. He's continued to commute to Portage and work there since he moved to Winnipeg in 1975. He currently practices law in partnership with his brother, Barry. So, David, the stage is yours. Yes.
I'll do that here. Good afternoon. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about the background of the Portage Jewish community. It's existed in Portage since 1902, when the first permanent Jewish resident arrived. And until 2020, it existed. The last descendant of the first Jewish resident was Bruce Narvey. So there are, after a period of about 120 years, there are no Jewish residents from the first people that arrived in 1902. Portage is significant because outside of Winnipeg, I believe there were only 2 communities that had synagogues, Brandon and Portage. So let me give you some details of how they arrived. Mr. Bonnet was the first resident of Portage. His name was David Bonnet. He was a Kohen. He brought with him a Torah, kind of significant, of the first resident, and he broke horses. And he brought his wife Tima after he lived there a while to Portage, and they had no children. And then he brought his sister and her husband to Portage. So over a period of time, as Khan said, people arrived probably not directly to Portage. They came from Eastern Europe to escape pogroms and for probably a better life. But they didn't come directly to Portage. They came from other communities. My grandparents, I'm told, my grandfather had stolen a passport. Our name wasn't Greenberg, but he didn't want to serve in the Tsar's army, so he got away. And my grandparents actually came via Leeds, England. They came to New York City, where two of my uncles were. My uncle Mike was born, and his sister Betty were born, and they eventually came to Portage. My grandfather, I understand, came to Portage because he had a friend in Winnipeg who said that there was work available in the smaller communities. And so they came to Portage, and there was many other first families that came to Portage. And initially they didn't have enough people for a union, but eventually they did. I'm told that the early Jewish people were observant, Orthodox, and they, as kind of said that there was always an issue with getting kosher food, and I don't know how observant they were. I think over a period of time they became less observant. That's kind of the history of Jewish people. I know that my first experience with observance was we had moved to another part of the city. We grew up living in my grandparents' house for about 4 or 5 years. And I remember going to my Baba's house on a Friday night. And I walked in first, and it was dark. So I says, "Baba, can I turn on the lights?" No answer. So I realized that I didn't know very much about Judaism at that point in time. However, I did eventually was asked by somebody other than my grandmother to turn on the light. So that was my first experience there. So other people came to Portage. My grandfather was a journeyman, a lathe, and he did plaster work. But I don't know the abilities of these people, their skills. They came to Portage, and most of them became merchants. As you mentioned, they were grocers, they had general stores, and almost everybody had their own business, and they seemed to be successful in that they earned a living. They all bought their own homes, and what was important to them was continuing the tradition of their families. Around 1920 to 30, they had hired a couple Jewish teachers to teach their children, and my father was probably a child of the first residents, became a member of that class. There may have been a dozen children in that class. So I don't know the level of observance. I know that there was a second group that I attended when I was born in 42, so I guess it was about 7 or 8 years later we had a class of our own there, and it seemed we had 2 or 3 different teachers all this time. And I always felt I was just graduating from grade 1 all the time. In all fairness, I think they did their best to hire people that knew some Yiddish, but they did their best. And there was a third class after that that were a younger group. Unfortunately, there was only one Jewish friend of mine that I was friendly with because he was the same age. His name was Zenith Wesby, so there were just the 2 of us. There was no Jewish girls of our age, so there was no Jewish girls. So anyways, I had a bar mitzvah in Portage, and funny how you keep these memories. I remember after I had I read from the Torah, I'm walking off the bima, and waiting at the bottom of the stairs for him was my Baba. It was very important to her that I became a bar mitzvah. And then most of our friends, of course, lived in Winnipeg, so my parents hosted a lunch at the local club of some kind, and it was a kosher meal. It was catered by Mr. Soslavsky, kind of a legendary figure from Winnipeg, and I remember I gave a Jewish speech. It was a very wonderful speech, and I spoke with passion to everybody, but I must tell you, and people seemed to receive it well, but the point was I didn't understand a word I was saying. I guess I had a very good memory. So that's my memories of the early years. So, we didn't experience any anti-Semitism or any pogroms. I read about these kids getting beat up at Winnipeg Beach by certain cultural groups, and we never had any of that, never experienced any anti-Semitism at any point in my life. And so I wanted to relate a story that Mel Narvey told me. The Narveys had clothing stores in Portage, as did the Rapkin family. And so Mel says to me, he had this very good friend of his who wasn't Jewish. He says, Mel, he says, how come you never asked me to give you a quote on fire insurance for your store? So Mel says, well, to be quite honest, I never thought of it. So he says, by all means, give me a quote. So this is a story that Mel related to me personally, and he said that about 2 weeks goes by, and he finally hears back from his friend, and the friend comes in cheaply and just says, they didn't want to write your insurance. So that was kind of I guess, a subtle a message about anti-Semitism. You've heard the expression Jewish dynamite, I'm sure, but that was the message. So just trying to think of so the families that came to Portage, there was the Rapkin family. They were very early. I think the Rapkins brought the second Torah. So we had 2 Torahs in Portage. And the Narveys opened a clothing store. There was Sam and Max Marmol. There was, there was a few other families. Bob Ross was a photographer, and a chap named Eddie Halfgott. And they raised their children in Portage. My father graduated as a lawyer in 1940. And he actually went on to become the first Jewish president of the Law Society of Manitoba. I don't know the fact he was in Portage made a difference, but that's what happened. So as I got a little older, I guess I was 7 or 8, I started to kind of reflect because of this as to how things evolved. So my Uncle Mike, the oldest of my of the children on my mother's side, got married to a Clara Schindelman. That was his wife. My Uncle Mike was a musician. He eventually became the conductor of the Alps Band. And so he married my Auntie Claire. I think my family, although they had a modest secondhand store, so I think they needed to create a business for my uncle to support his wife to come to Portage. So the family staked him. I think they built a grocery store on the other side of town, which was a resounding success from day one. I think the best thing that happened to my uncle was he married Clara Schindelman, who was a very hard worker. She brought her brother Ed Schindelman to Portage at that time, and he brought his brother Jack. They were cattlemen too, but Eddie was a very good entrepreneur and businessman. I think he really built my uncle's store, and he then brought her younger sister Gladys to Portage, her husband Benny Kushner, and I think Ben opened a auto wrecking business in Portage. The Schindelman brothers had a little farm east of Portage. They gave him some land, and Ben was in business and became very involved in the Jewish community. And Ben became an alderman in the city. Jack Schindelman became an alderman. And there was another family, but then another gentleman named of Irvin Callan. He came to Portage later, and he had a shoe store. He became an alderman also. So they became very involved in the community. But what I remember, when they built a new synagogue building around 1950, and Izzy Sokolow, his father-in-law was, I think, Sam Stitz, I believe. He had he moved to Clear Lake to run a store there. How am I doing time-wise? You checking my phone? Am I running out of time? Okay, well, I'll try to fast forward it. Anyways, he was instrumental in building the synagogue. So they built a new synagogue in 1950. And from the time that a new synagogue was built, my father made a point of taking me to shul every Friday night. And we did that. And I'm grateful to my family and my parents for instilling that in me. And just trying to condense what I've got to say here. One thing I remembered about my uncle's grocery store, and you mentioned about the non-Jewish community, I once had a person who worked at the land titles office come up to me, and she was talking about growing up in rural Portage. She said the Greenbergs kept us alive, and just what you're alluding to with credit, groceries in the wintertime, they had no money, but they were very good, and it worked out very nicely. So the other thing I wanted to mention was when we always closed on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, my parents, they put an ad in the paper, Jewish New Year, the offices are closing. We kept that tradition until we had non-Jewish lawyers in our firm. But I remember one Saturday night, it fell on Yom Kippur. And the store stayed closed till about 9 o'clock at night, till Yom Kippur was over. And if you went over to Grieber's Grocery a block over, the people, all the customers lined up waiting for the store to open at 9 o'clock at night. That's how important it was to them. So that's kind of the history. There's so much more I'd like to tell you, but I was given 10 minutes, and you started looking at me, so but the merchants had very good stores, the Narvies, the Rapkins, the chap named Momar, and they came in, and what I wanted to tell you was, and I won't have time, is how Portage started the Jewish community started to, I wouldn't say it died off, people moved away. And there's a separate story, and I don't have enough time to tell it. But my son wrote a very good article when he was in high school in Winnipeg, and it was about the Jewish community of Portage. And Bill had published it within the last 6 months, I think, a year ago? Okay, the whole story. But Michael ended up with a very nice paragraph, and I'd like to read that to you. It's not me, it's my son. He was talking about when the synagogue closed in '79. He said, a famous Broadway musical, Fiddler on the Roof, noted the fondness Jewish people have for tradition. And while that characteristic may be valid, the same turbulent existence which fostered that touchstone also endowed them with an accompanying pragmatism, and enabling some of it to be placed in perspective. The community thrived as long as it had the means and the will to do so. And when it was no longer expedient, logic dictated that its activities be discontinued. So that was kind of what he said. I'm not going to read the rest of the paragraph. You can read it in the Jewish Historical Society. But thank you for listening, and thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, we're just doing this alphabetically to be very fair.
Alphabetically by town.
Oh, I did it by names. Oi. I'm sorry, Lou. I was going to introduce Sid next. Well, Brandon is up there. Okay. Sid was born in Brandon, and he lived there until his family moved to Winnipeg in the mid-'50s. He studied music in the United States and in Toronto, where he began his career as a composer. He returned to Winnipeg in 1986 and has remained here, working in the music field. And his fame precedes him. So, Sid, thank you.
Okay, this is sort of a personal reminiscence about growing up in Brandon, and maybe you'll learn something about the history of the Jewish community there. My father's family arrived in the port of Quebec on June 26, 1904, on the SS Montreal Canadian ship, which had set sail from the European port of Antwerp. How they got to Antwerp, I will never know. Interestingly, the whole family is listed on the ship's manifest under the name Rabay, or perhaps Rabag, it's hard to tell, and not Rabinovich. And their destination is given as Brandon, Manitoba. My father had always said that he believed that our original name was indeed something akin to Rabay, but we never had any confirmation of this until computer searches of ships' passenger lists were available. I have had a cousin who's passed on, and she did a little research and came up with a ship. She knew approximately when the family came to Canada, and she looked at the manifests of the ships that had arrived in that period, and she came up with the actual ship. And what's more, we know that by 1906, 2 years after their arrival in Canada, the Brandon census lists the names of all the family members as Robinovich, from Robey. Why the change in name was made, we will never know. Was Robey apparently a derivative of the word rabbi, thought to be too grandiose a designation for a very unremarkable family of Jews newly arrived out of the Bessarabian shtetl? Or was Robey just thought to be not Jewish sounding enough? I don't suppose we will ever know why the change occurred, but indeed Robinovich became the name, and thus it remains to this day. In the end, there is no real significance in having gone from a Robey to a Robinovich, but one thing we can say for sure, it probably represents one of the few examples of name lengthening in the history of immigration to the New World. My mother was born in St. Thomas, Ontario in 1911. Her father moved to Winnipeg several years later and eventually ended up in Biggar, Saskatchewan, where my mother spent her formative years. The family moved to Saskatoon later on, and that is where my father, still residing in Brandon after that long trip from Russia in 1904, courted her. The young couple were married in 1935 and took up residence in Brandon, where my father had a general clothing business called the Army and Navy Store. It was no relationship to the Army and Navy Store, which was headquartered in Regina. And I remember when somebody would come in and complain about the merchandise they received, my father, they would say, well, you better contact our head office in Regina about that. Okay. My parents lived the first 20 years of their married life in Brandon, raising their 2 children, my sister Lynn and myself, and taking part in the life of the Jewish community, which at that time may have consisted of 20 or so families. I remember Sunday afternoon drives in the country to the experimental farm or to Bing Jukes Drive-In on Highway 10 for French fries, visits to the annual provincial exhibition at the fairgrounds, and especially summer vacations at Clear Lake. There were a lot of Jewish people from Winnipeg at Clear Lake, and I'm sure many of you have memories of Clear Lake, many of whom congregated at Donner's Lodge. We could have done a whole project on Donner's Lodge itself, where one night of the summer was set aside for a talent show in the downstairs lounge. My mother was a pretty good singer and entertained the audience with favorites of hers, such as Oh Promise Me and Hello Young Lovers. At Clear Lake, I met quite a few Jewish teenagers, and I continued to associate with them after we moved to Winnipeg ourselves in 1955. There were all sorts of things to do at the lake: swimming, boating, bowling, roller skating, and horseback riding, but mainly just roaming around the streets of the picturesque and fun-filled little town site. One evening, my parents couldn't find me and actually sent out the RCMP to conduct a search. And where was little Sydney to be found? Standing in the doorway at Danceland, listening to the Johnny Bering Band. For their social life, my family mixed almost exclusively with other members of Brandon's Jewish community. I remember Saturday night poker games, men and women playing at separate tables, and Sunday afternoon gatherings at Crystal's Delicatessen on Rosser Avenue. As far as the religious aspect of our lives was concerned, it was basic but not entirely overlooked. We kept kosher in the home, bringing in our meat by train from Winnipeg. There was the old synagogue at 3rd and Princess, which, aside from the odd community event, really only functioned as a religious facility on the high holidays. Women sat upstairs in the gallery and conversed amongst themselves. The men carried on downstairs in what sounded to me like a continuous and undifferentiated, and unending drone. A gentleman by the name of Jake Dressler led the services every year. Jake prepared me for my bar mitzvah, which was held in the Brandon Synagogue just before we moved to Winnipeg in 1955. I took my lessons in Jake's room at the YMCA after he got home from his work at McGavin's Bakery. Jake was a refugee from Poland who, I never really learned from my parents, had lost his entire family during the Shoah. It was typical that parents didn't really talk very much about that at that time of year. I know Dan's done a whole project on that. aside from the high holiday services, I would say that the annual family Passover Seder was the main religious observance for most Jews in Brandon. There were several attempts to bring in Hebrew teachers, and I think made reference to this, from Winnipeg, but these never really achieved much success, and I think you will can go along with that. On Saturday afternoons, I would go to the movies, quite often a double feature at the Jewish-owned Oak Theater. Roy Rogers and the Bowery Boys were my favorites. I was one of the 2 or 3 Jewish kids at the school that attended I was one of the 2 or 3 Jewish kids at the school that I attended and belonged to the Cubs and Boy Scouts. I remember a particular father and son event where the guest speaker gave a talk about how every father had an obligation to teach his son how to use a rifle. My father was not impressed by the event and referred to it disparagingly on several occasions afterwards. Hunting was not an activity the Jews normally engaged in Brandon, although I do remember the odd excursion to the town of Souris, just to the south of Brandon, where we would fish, usually without much to show for our afternoon's labors, off the old swinging bridge that Souris was known for. Outside of school, my life in Brandon was confined pretty much to the home. I had a few friends from school, but I always felt that I was different. I was aware of being Jewish, even though I really had no sense of what Jewishness was all about. I would say that the only time that I had any exposure to Jewish culture was when I attended Herzl Camp in Wisconsin. You might wonder how I got there. One summer when I was 12 years old, my parents had become friendly with a couple from Minot, North Dakota, and they had a son my age who had gone to Herzl in past years. I went along with him one summer, and for me it was a real eye-opener being in an environment with so many other Jewish youngsters. I was exposed to a lot of Hebrew songs at Herzl, and to this day I still remember the Birkat Hamazon and V'ahavta prayers that I learned there. I can honestly say that things changed drastically for me when we moved to Winnipeg when I was 13. My sister had already moved there a year earlier to attend the University of Manitoba, staying, as was often the case, in the home of a Jewish widow. I had a large group of Jewish buddies in Winnipeg. Maybe the fact that I had an old pool table in my basement that the former occupants of the house had left there accounted in part for my popularity. I went to school with these guys and participated with them in clubs such as AZA, the B'nai B'rith Organization, United Synagogue Youth, and the YMHA. In the 50s and 60s, Jewish adolescent life in Winnipeg was a powerful force. I would say that my identity as a Jew only really began to take shape after moving to the larger center. Yes, indeed, we were aware of being Jewish in Brandon, but for me, we were more defined by what we didn't do than by what we did do. We didn't go to school on the high holidays, we didn't have Christmas trees, and we didn't go to visit Grandma and Grandpa on the family farm. Indeed, Brandon's Jews had a history of their own, and there had even existed, I found out later, a Jewish radical contingent there at one time. But there was no real sense of community that gave Winnipeg its distinctive Jewish character, where being Jewish was not an inconvenience or even an embarrassment, but an all-enveloping presence. In my father's generation, it was different growing up in Brandon. A remnant of the Jewish values still prevailed from the shtetl, but by my generation, they had worn pretty thin. This is not meant to be an indictment of growing up Jewish in a smaller prairie center. Brandon was certainly a very nice place to live, but it cannot provide the strong community values that emanate from a larger center. Just as Morley Torgov said about growing up Jewish in Sault Ste. Marie, Brandon was a, quote, good place to come from. And fortunately, I got out at just about the right time. Thank you.
Next, I'm very pleased to introduce Lil Zentner. I interviewed her at great length, and I hope she can bring back some of those stories. She grew up in Esterhazy, Saskatchewan, where her family ran the general store. She moved to Winnipeg at age 16 to attend high school and then received her BA and BEd from the University of Manitoba. Her teaching career spanned 35 years, beginning with teaching at all levels in public schools in West Kildonan, Transcona, and Selkirk. For the last 22 years of her teaching career, she taught at Joseph Wolinski Collegiate. And I now give you Lil.
Sorry, I have to get organized. First of all, my story is, I think, more personal than the other two people. I hope that that's okay. So, when I began to write this piece, I pondered, how do I sum up 16 years of my life in 10 minutes? Therefore, I decided to focus on the highlights, and I hope you will take with you stories of my family and my love for Judaism and for Israel. I'll begin. My parents, Max Bober and Eva Zellman, were married in 1935 in Winnipeg. How they met and fell in love is a story for another time. My mom moved to Esterhazy, Saskatchewan, a small town of then 800 people, with many farms surrounding. My dad had lived in Esterhazy since 1926, and eventually he owned a small general store, and my parents became partners in this business. That was quite rare, by the way, because usually women did not become business people, but my mom did. As our town did not have a hospital, my mother came to Winnipeg 1 month before my brother Harold was born, his birth September 1936. In 1940, I was born in Melville, Saskatchewan, the nearest hospital. We didn't have a hospital in Esterhazy. During my and Harold's early years, our parents spoke to us in English, but also very much so in Yiddish, as they strongly wanted us to identify as Jews. Both had immigrated to Canada, my dad with his family in 1921, from the Ukraine, which is now Russia, or the other way around, from Russia, which is now Ukraine, and Mom alone from Poland in 1930. That's another story as well. Both spoke Yiddish, Polish, Ukrainian, and Russian, and they self-taught in English when they came here. I grew up in Esterhazy until I was 16 when I came to Winnipeg for grade 11 and then went on to university. My brother Harold had come before me after his grade 12 graduation, was attending University of Manitoba, and was living with relatives. Education was of utmost importance to my parents, probably second to being Jewish, and both of us kids were expected to attend and graduate from university. No questions asked, no discussions, totally mandated. And it was quite rare, by the way, for young girls to have that kind of a family. In Esterhazy, we had one large school, grades 1 to 12, and I believe that Harold and I received a good education there. As there were only 3 Jewish families living in our town, Bobers, us 4, Markoviches, Auntie Jean and Uncle Harry and Eugene and Karen, Gornsteins, Uncle Isaac and Auntie Sonia and Beverly. We 3 families were considered related to each other, even though we weren't, very specially intertwined, even at school. Of course, the 5 of us were in different grades, so we had our own age level friends, Gentiles. I had many close Christian girlfriends, all of whom I recall respected my religion as I respected theirs. I proudly wore my Magen David all the time. My parents did not form close friendships with many Gentiles, as they had the other two Jewish families. Also, Jewish families from small surrounding towns would gather on Sundays and holidays to be together. Usually, either they would drive to Esterhazy to visit us, or we would drive to other towns such as Stockholm, Langenberg, Dubuque, and others. Socialization was always with Jewish families. During summer months, our family, the Markoviches, and families from Stockholm and Langenberg would meet at Round Lake, a 2-hour drive away. Sundays, particularly, and we also rented cabins sometimes to sleep over for Mondays, because Mondays our store was also closed. We had wonderful get-togethers. From the time Harold and I and other Jewish friends were early teens, we would spend 2 weeks every summer at a Habonim camp in the Qu'Appelle Valley. It was a way of connecting with other Jewish kids from towns in Saskatchewan, and some of these became pen pal friends. Sorry. What's going on here? As for Jewish traditions and holidays, firstly, my parents kept strictly kosher. This was quite a feat. Separate dishes, etc., for meat and dairy, never eaten together. Also, we did not have a home freezer, so we would rent a locker in our town's freezer building. All beef products were ordered from Regina and came frozen by train. This is an interesting story, which I hope you won't choke at. Chickens we bought from farmers, and we would drive them in our car's trunk live and in crates to Melville, Saskatchewan, 60 miles away, where a shocher, who is a particular, I guess you would call him a butcher, who would butcher them. Upon returning home, Harold, my parents, would cut off their heads, pluck them, and clean them to prepare them for the locker, and then we would put them in the locker to freeze. For Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, our store would be closed, and we would drive to Melville again, where there was a larger Jewish community and 2 synagogues. Jewish families there would welcome us to their homes for meals and for sleepovers before and after synagogue. They were amazing people. In particular, I remember our family being hosted by the Weinstein family, who are now in Winnipeg. For Pesach, the first day, our store would also close. We 3 Jewish families in Esterhazy would alternate having seders. Occasionally, families from surrounding towns would also be invited. Pesach was strictly observed in our home. All of our Pesach products were shipped to us from Regina, and I recall always eating at home. We were never allowed to eat out. Although a bat mitzvah for me was not even considered, a bar mitzvah for my brother Harold was certain to happen. He was sent to Winnipeg for a year when he was 12 years old to attend St. John's High School, and especially to have Sunday and after-school Hebrew classes to study for his bar mitzvah, which happened in September of 1950. As I mentioned previously, my mom and dad ran our family store as partners. There were 2 other general stores in our town. One was owned by the Markoviches, our good friends. The other was owned by a Gentile family. Therefore, in order to draw people to be competitive, we had to specialize in a particular area. My mom was very talented in sewing, so we had a large section of our store called dry goods, bolts of cloth, patterns, sewing materials, etc. This area was a hit, particularly with many of the women farmers. Most customers were loyal to one particular store, and we knew that many would only patronize the non-Jewish one. Our customers respected and liked my parents, but partly because they spoke Polish or Ukrainian with them. As most of our patrons were farmers from nearby farms, they would particularly shop on Friday night or Saturday night, up to as late as midnight. Credit was also a factor, which you mentioned, Chana. Most customers had accounts. They didn't pay cash. They bought gifts which we recorded by hand. They paid at the end of the month or even later. a very, very trusting relationship between my parents and them. As we became older, Harold and I both worked in the store with our parents, and usually we had one other employee. When I was 10, I was a full member of the team. Our math had to be perfect. There were no calculators, because my parents were always concerned about latent anti-Semitism. It was not outward, but it was latent. Many times my dad would recheck my billing. Harold and I were always reminded, be on your best behavior. My dad and mom expected us to be role models for the Jewish people. More about my brothers and my relationships with friends. As mentioned previously, we always had close friends. Much of our social life revolved around the school. I was a member of the school choir, also because I was taking private piano lessons. I was always asked to accompany at concerts and recitals. We participated every year in the Saskatchewan Music Festival, which was held in Yorkton. Harold was a very talented hockey player, and his team traveled to many surrounding towns. Parents and kids would accompany them. I recall many trips when the four of us would drive in our car loaded with hockey equipment, usually on Sunday afternoons or Monday after school, because our store was closed on Sunday and Monday. I was not particularly athletic, but on the school's volleyball team and also on the curling team. My dad, being an avid curler, was determined that I should follow in his footsteps. Also, I loved curling, and I continued in this sport even in Winnipeg when I came for grade 11 at West Kelowna Collegiate, and for my first 2 years at the University of Manitoba. I actually curled when I was pregnant. Two incidents still etched in my memory remind me of how strict and how determined my parents were in their pride of being Jewish and passing this on to us kids. The first incident. School Christmas concerts were the highlights of every year. It was challenging for us Jewish kids when we were young to be surrounded everywhere by Christmas decorations and gifts. My parents would try to make it up to us by having parties with families for Hanukkah and Hanukkah Gelt, which we received. We were always reminded, though, that Hanukkah was our holiday and not to be confused with Christmas. I recall an incident at school when I was approximately 8 years old. Because I had a beautiful singing voice, my choir teacher chose me to be an angel at the concert, at the top of a ladder beside a Christmas tree, singing Silent Night. I was so excited. I ran home during lunch and I screamed to my mom the fabulous news. "Sorry," she said to me, "this cannot happen. No solo, no Christmas carols. You can be in the choir in the back row, only you have to sing songs like Jingle Bells and other kinds, not religious carols. If you want to be part of this choir and you want to stand there, you can mouth the words, but you can't sing." A visit to the teacher followed when my mother explained that it was not permissible for me as a Jewish person to sing carols. I was devastated. I couldn't be the angel, but I did stand in the back row, and I followed my mom's instructions. A second incident. As I entered the teenage years, all of my friends were dating, and I was a part of this scene. The only Jewish boy in Esterhazy was Eugene, and he was like a brother to me. I wasn't going to date him. It was forbidden for me to date non-Jews. So I would sneak, not even telling my brother. I'll never forget one summer evening when I was at a restaurant with my boyfriend Mickey and my friends. My father entered. I was escorted out by my dad, who shouted, "You are not allowed to be here." At least he didn't say why. I almost died of humiliation. Upon arriving home, I was lectured by both parents who had discovered that I had a boyfriend. I was not allowed to date Gentile boys. That was final. Mom and Dad and I had a huge blow-up. I tried to explain to my parents that all my friends were dating, and if I couldn't date non-Jews, then I needed to move to Winnipeg so I could have the opportunity to date Jewish people. Therefore, in September of 1956, I became a student of West Kildonan Collegiate in Winnipeg, living with an aunt and uncle. In November of that year, my parents, having no future plans, lonely for Harold and me, wanting the four of us to be together, sold their business, their home, they sold everything at a huge sacrifice and moved to Winnipeg. My parents' strong pride in being Jewish flourished when the State of Israel was born. I recall one late Saturday afternoon when a very significant phone call came from Winnipeg to our store. We didn't have a phone in our home. My father answered, motioned to my mom, and then they both began to cry. Of the 47 members of my mom's immediate family in Poland, only 2 nieces and 1 nephew had survived the Shoah. Sarah, Gisya, and Yoel had somehow contacted a Jewish agency in Canada to connect with my mother. They were alive, and they were building new lives in Israel. You can just imagine the joy, the excitement, especially for my mom. It was beyond belief. Their story of survival is also for another time. What followed this discovery was our new attachment to Israel, to our Israeli family, and to the State of Israel, love and devotion, and our determination to be proud Zionists. In conclusion, I wish to credit my parents for instilling in Harold and me such deep pride in being Jewish and such love for Israel. In spite of the hardships they endured, the sacrifices they made, surrounded by a community in which they truly did not belong, it would have been much easier for them to blend in and accept a different life. Although my brother and I were taught such significant values as respect and tolerance for all people, we were always reminded that we were Jews. This was a privilege that was to be engraved in our hearts and souls forever. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lil. And last but not least, we have Bruce Sarvett. Bruce grew up in Selkirk, and his family moved to Winnipeg when he was 17 and about to start university. After that, he worked as a counselor at Brandon University, where he and Celia raised their family. When he retired, they moved to Winnipeg. Bruce now searches in his plays and his essays for lives worth living, for community and meaning. Bruce.
Well, what an honor it is to speak after these fine folks. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, maybe it's, okay, that worked. Yeah. All right. Gosh, I have so many comments on so much of what was said, but I'm just going to launch into this. And Dan, you are my timekeeper. Where are you? Right here. Right there? Okay, if I'm going over, Dan, you give me the nod. Yeah? Okay. So I called this Selkirk Stettlers. This is your hometown. Bruce Springsteen, not a Jewish fellow, but a great singer, said, Dad'd tussle my hair and say, son, take a good look around. This is your hometown. And of course, the Beatles sang, once there was a way to get back home again. The family drives to Winnipeg, then back again to Selkirk when there were 2 roads, when the roads were 2-lane every Sunday to visit family, dads, mums, and on Jewish holidays. The catfish capital of the world, Selkirk, Manitoba. Don't confuse it with the Avenue. Named in honor of the 5th Earl of Selkirk, about 22 kilometers northeast of Winnipeg. Population now over 10,000. It was closer to around 5 when I lived there. Dad, keen to get to Selkirk. Now, this is 2003. He was 90. He was keen to get to Selkirk and the Selkirk Old Timers Reunion. He insisted, we don't want to be late. I arrived early at his sterile senior's home, the Tuxedo Villa. He was dressed and so excited. He had been to the bathroom 3 times. I pushed the wheelchair toward the front entrance. But before we could leave, he needed a cigarette, as central to his life as eating. Cigarette snuffed Dad called shotgun. And we got in, we're going to Selkirk. Now, to get to Selkirk, you know the way, right? To get there and the reunion and our tour of Jewish Selkirk, we needed to go by way of Broadway to Winnipeg's Main Street, to the CNR's Grand Union Station, then to follow it north. And had we arrived there in 1914, 90 years before, we might have seen Dad's dad, Jacob, who had come by way of Paris, from Jerusalem. Think about it, Selkirk, Paris, Jerusalem. Which would you choose? So he had arrived, he came through the large doors now of the station. His welcoming committee, a friend from Jerusalem's yeshiva, where he had attended, and Mr. Gray, after whom the Jewish Academy is named. They would have helped him onto the streetcar that'd take him to Selkirk, where he'd be the Jewish community's lehrer, teacher, chazan, cantor, and shochet. Now, following the same route that Jacob had taken, we were on our way home to Selkirk. The direction, straight, Dad'd say, to which his mum, Goldie, would reply sardonically, straight sedreit, which means straight crazy. 4 blocks north, we arrived at Portage in Maine, the center of Winnipeg, Chicago of the North, banks and grain exchanges on every corner, famous for howling winds and temperatures of 50 below, past the central site of the 1919 General Strike, City Hall, Market Square, past the Royal Alexandra Hotel, where Mom and Dad had their wedding reception and started their honeymoon trip to Portage La Prairie. They stayed at the Mayfair Hotel. Yeah. Once under the CP rail bridge, we entered, now this is significant, it's like passing the perimeter, but only earlier. We entered Winnipeg's North End, home of the city's vibrant Jewish community and our family stories. Yeah. Past Selkirk Avenue, the center of Jewish commerce, we'd remember the old Ashkenazi synagogue on Burroughs, the Chesed Shel Emes, and behind it, the Sharon Seniors Home, where Baba Goldie and Celia's mom spent their last days. Past Kalekis's, where we'd enjoy niched kosher, split hot dogs, Billy Mosienko's bowling alley, past Mountain Avenue, where my mom's family had lived, had their grocery store. We saluted Oscar's Deli and Simon's, which served our favorite corned beef sandwiches, thin sliced, hot mustard, kosher dill pickle, bottle of cream soda. A couple of blocks off Main Street, but easily pictured, were the Talmud Torah, where we'd attended high holiday services with Mom's family, and the Rosh Pina, where we'd visited Dad's family, where I'd been bar mitzvah, and where Celia and I had been married. Past the cemeteries. The Sharet Tzedek, remembering Dad's parents, Jacob and Goldie. Mom's parents, Celia's parents and family, and the Rosh Pina Cemetery, where my mother, my aunts and uncles, were buried beyond the perimeter highway, past the B'nai Avraham Cemetery, through burgeoning housing developments and familiar farmland, we sang. As in the old days when we had no radio in the sedan delivery truck, my brother and I sitting on the floorboards. Irene, good night. And Red River Valley, from this valley they say we are going. Past Lockport, Skinner's Hot Dogs, and Lower Fort Garry, the fur trading post of the Selkirk settlers and Stettlers. We drove toward town along the gorgeous River Road, and when it became Eveline Street and Selkirk, Dad grinned and said, "Hey, we're home." And we sang, "Be it ever so humble." Now, crossing the perimeter for some Winnipegonians, is that the right word? Winnipeggers, is like entering an alien world. And many entering Selkirk for the first time will only associate it with the mental hospital. They don't know Selkirk and its proud Jewish heritage. Despite maybe because of the town's small Jewish population, a maximum of 20 families at its peak, Selkirk fostered a strong sense of community among its members, helped them hold on to their cultural and religious traditions, observe holidays, celebrate Shabbat, practice kashrut, and maintain their Yiddish language. As they ran businesses, groceries, and dry goods for the most part, that necessitated interactions with the non-Jewish population. In the main, the Scottish descendants of Selkirk settlers, Indigenous and Métis people, Icelanders and Ukrainians. While some rural communities had a synagogue, as we've heard, and a cemetery, because of its proximity to Winnipeg, Selkirk didn't. Sure, Shabbat services were held in the space above Billy Epstein's fur trading store. But everyone, but for rare occasions, I suppose when the roads were closed, in the basement of the Masonic Hall, they traveled to Winnipeg for the holidays and to be buried. And in my case, for everything Jewish, Hebrew lessons, Sunday Jewish history classes, YMHA clubs. Rare are the occasions when Jacob could make a minyan. How disappointing it must have been for him. Sure, he was community shoichet and taught the few Jewish children, perhaps until the late 30s. But the income wasn't enough. So Goldie ran the corner grocery store and raised the kids while Jacob helped when he wasn't davening. We drove in along Eveline, remembering that the railroad used to come in from Winnipeg along it, enjoyed the tree-lined until we reached the bridge. Continuing north, we remembered the town's first Jewish pioneers, late 1880s, Finkelman's, later of Elman's Food Products, and W. Billy Epstein, both fur trading and general stores. Past the road down to the river and the docks where passengers disembarked, fish and furs were offloaded. 2 blocks on, we turned left at Morris Avenue. Are you with me? Yeah, turn left. Okay. And making our way back to Main Street. Yes, the same Main Street that we left in Winnipeg. We fondly remembered our store, Sarbit's, for a time the biggest independent store in Western Canada, that occupied the southwest corner from 1915 or so until 1965, when Dad sold it so I could move to Winnipeg, go to university, and meet a nice Jewish girl. Yeah. Now, by the way, the store is the biggest big dollar store in the world. It's on 2 of the other 3 corners, there had been grocery stores owned by Jews, Schlein and Merovich. Count them, okay, as we go. All Jewish businesses. We're heading south now on Main Street. In a short 2 blocks, we passed Rifkin's Snack Bar, Silverman's Clothing, Packer's Clothing in what was the Canton Block, and Oscar Canton's hot dog stand. A left turn down Manitoba Avenue. If you know Selkirk, Manitoba Avenue is like its main street. It would be like Portage Avenue. Smaller, obviously. And in the 1 block before the river and the docks, we passed in quick succession, each with fond memories. On the north side, buildings that had once housed Cowlson's Pool Hall, Feld's Clothing and Grocery Store, and Rothstein's Gary Theater. Across the street on the south side, one after the other, Cowlson's Clothing, Saul Epstein's Clothing, Wassell's Law Office, Chazanoff's, Peikoff's, and Fingold's. Slow down, Dad says. Then Schiffman's, Bloom's, Sam Epstein's, Polly's Barber Shop, where Jacob, my grandfather, Dad, and I, 3 generations of Sarbits, had our hair cut by Alex, the singing barber. We stopped briefly in front of the SOS department store, Tennenhaus and Marantz, before continuing past what would have been Nowensky's shoe store, Silverman's, Kovitz's, Rifkin's and Morovich's, Stores General and Dry Goods. At the end of the street, at the Merchants Hotel, a stop sign. We took a breath, not a long one. And instead of continuing down to the docks, we turned right and drove back down Eveline, the 7 blocks, to the golf course and the reunion. The place we call home, right? Stettel, town, city, Portage la Prairie, Brandon, Esterhazy, Winnipeg, Selkirk, is essential to who we are. We endow the place with personal meaning, and it in turn provides us with a sense of identity and some stability as we adapt to life's circumstances in a rapidly changing world. True of the Selkirk of my early and formative years. It was doubly so for Dad, who arrived at age 3 from Jerusalem, lived and worked there until his mid-50s. He loved Selkirk. It was in his blood, an essential part of who he was as a person, a proudly Jewish person, and Selkirk loved him. Among other things, he was a Rotarian and twice president of the Chamber of Commerce. He even ran for MLA and lost by a mere 39 votes. I pulled up in front of the golf course, clubhouse where the old-timers reunion, organized by Oscar Canton, was being held. Before I could retrieve the wheelchair, Dad, once again anxious, said we should go home. But we were home. Have a cigarette, calm down, think it over. 2 puffs, and Dad was surrounded by several fellows shaking his hand, patting him on the back affectionately, remembering when they worked in his store. I was 16, my first job, one said. Another delivered groceries on the bike when he was only 15. Got about 3 minutes left. How much did I pay you, Dad asked. 25 cents an hour? True, but still a teasing accusation. Holding out his hand, Dad teased back. I overpaid you. You owe me. The camaraderie buoying him, Dad stomped out the cigarette so we could head into the reunion. He lapped it up as people greeted him. Dad had come home, as had I. While we enjoyed the reunion, there was a significant absence in the room. The conversation was often about people who'd moved and those who'd left their Selkirk pasts behind, moved to Winnipeg for their children. Those too infirm or at too great a distance, and saddest of all, those who had passed away. The reunion was unofficially as much about those missing as those actually there And for the few Jews who, like us, had driven from Winnipeg, it reminded us that the era in which Jews formed a significant part of the Selkirk community was long gone. On our way back to Winnipeg, as we passed back beyond the perimeter, we reflected on what had once been our home, the Selkirk shtetl, for scores of Jews. All gone, but we had remembered. And Dad, glad that he'd been back to Selkirk, his old home, saying, "Thanks for the memory," as we passed the perimeter and entered Winnipeg. That's it.
Thank you, Bruce. Yes, it is on. No, the slideshow didn't materialize. Okay. But
I was supposed to have a slideshow, but despite Steve's valiant efforts, my computer wasn't up to the task. Oh, okay. No slideshow.
okay. We're going to spend a few minutes with, first of all, I'm going to see if the people who shared their stories have any questions to ask of each other, and then we'll entertain questions from the audience before we go down for our treats. So I have one question for David. What was the, how many Jews were there in Portage at its best?
We had two surges of, can you hear me?
Yeah.
We had two surges of people. The original people came in the 20s. And around 1945, there was many families came in. The Max Nelco, the Robinsons, with all these bus people. So I think there was maybe 20, 25 families in its golden era. And there was a story which I didn't get a chance to tell of how the community started to die. It was a cultural thing. People had came to Portage, they earned their living, they had a good life, but when they were ready to go, they closed their businesses and they moved to large and urban centers. And that's kind of the story of Portage. I could talk a lot more, but.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the audience?
Do you know the Herzl Camp song?
We started with years, dear old Eric,
Did you go there to Herzl? Oh, you did, okay. It was a good place.
There's somebody further back. Sarah.
No, I'm just wondering, for all of you growing up where you lived, were there synagogues there that you attended?
Did everyone hear the question? Yeah. So were there synagogues in all the places you grew up?
Okay, I think I mentioned there was no, our town only had 800 people. Or maybe by the time I left, there was probably maybe 1,200. We never had a synagogue because we only had 3 Jewish families. And then one more family came, but then one left. So our closest synagogue was Melville, Saskatchewan. And that they had a very nice-sized community. They had 2 synagogues in the town. There was a group of Weinstein families. I don't know if any of you are familiar with them. They live in Winnipeg. There was 2 or 3 Weinstein families. They were all in Melville. And then there were other families. So I don't remember the Jewish population, but they did have 2 synagogues, small ones.
Yes, Brandon did have a synagogue. I had bar mitzvah there. It had the gallery, the women, I think I mentioned the women's gallery upstairs and the women did what they thought they were supposed to do. They conversed amongst themselves during the service. And the synagogue my father had told me, he was a youngster at the synagogue, he told me that they had transported from a different location where it ended up on 3rd and Princess, I believe, and it functioned until, I think, the 70s. And then it was sold to it became a civic
As the Portage Prairie, I understood that they started having services. Can you hear me now? Yeah. They started having services around 1920, and they were held in homes, and continually. But once the synagogue was constructed about 1950, services were held obviously in the high holidays. But every Friday night, there was a couple of gentlemen who were very knowledgeable, and they conducted the services. But we never had services on Saturday because the merchants had to earn a living, and they worked. So there was no Saturday morning services. To be quite honest, growing up, I didn't even realize until I married Nessie and moved to Winnipeg that there was such a thing as a Saturday morning service. And here I grew up in Portage, so it was quite a shock for me to realize there was much more to religious observance on the Shabbat.
David, where was the synagogue in Portage?
It was on the east side of the city, on the southeast, on a street called 3rd Street Southeast. It eventually was sold to a church organization. I understand you're not supposed to do that, but anyways, it didn't survive, and it's now a duplex or something.
Sharon, do you want the mic? My name is Sharon Love, but her surname was Samakala, Russian name, which was shortened when my grandfather came here. And usually when all the time when someone says you're related to so-and-so, I just say no when I walk away. So about 20 years ago, I was introduced to an older gentleman named the late Paul Kennedy. And he said, "Are you related to David Love?" And I said, "No," and I walked away. Then I walked back in. I said, "Why do you ask?" Well, Mr. Kettner grew up in Kenora. And what happened with a lot of the Jewish boys, if there was no shul close by, even if they could, like to go to Regina, they would take the bus there once a week. Anyways, there was a central large center, and the center in those days was Winnipeg. And some of them ended up living in the orphanage for a year. They had no family or friends to live with. So why did you ask me about David Love? David's father and my grandfather were brothers, and this was before my time. And David's father had a car, and David and his brother and sister and parents were driving somewhere. And I guess my great uncle caught some of the gravel on the road. And in those days, the doors didn't have any locks. There might have been a latch. And what happened was that David was sitting in the back seat, and the door opened, and he was thrown out of the car, and he was killed. So I was just amazed at how that man remembered that like so many years ago. So I guess if you were coming from a small center with no Jewish kids or very few Jewish friends, the fact that you made one or some was really, important in your life.
Try and line up. Are there any other questions before we begin?
I don't know that it's so much a question.
I don't know that it's so much a question as to add to some of the things that our presenters have said. My parents came to Canada in in 26 and 27, and there's lots of stories to tell. But in 1943, my uncle Ben Zelkovich persuaded my folks, who were really struggling, to move to Frobisher, Saskatchewan, to buy the Riddell's store. Now, the only thing it had in that entire town of 187 people was electricity. So you just, and I can see around here that many of you lived in small towns somewhere. So you know what we didn't have. But my uncle Ben Zelkovich lived in Estevan. So we were 10 miles from Hirsch Colony, which my husband and I visited about 6 years ago. We visited the cemetery there. Anyway, he lived in Estevan. But the first year we went, we closed the store for Yom Kippur, and we went to Hirsch. They had a little synagogue there, and they had brought somebody in from Winnipeg, and we had services. The other thing I would mention from what a lot of you have said is that we too got rotten meat. My mother tried very, very hard to keep kosher, but without running water, it was impossible. But the other thing was that for me anyway, and I can't say that for my older brothers, one was 4 years older than me and the other 10 years, but for me anyway, the Jewishness and the fact we were Jewish was utmost important. And when I was 16, my parents allowed me to go by myself on train to Philadelphia to meet my father's family, with whom I'm still very, very close. My two brothers went to, or my older brother stayed until he could join the army. And my other brother went off to university when I was 14. When I was 16, I went to Estevan for grade 11, and then my parents said, we send our boys to the city without us, but we take our daughters there. So that's just part of the experience. I could tell you so many things. But again, unlike you, who did not seem to suffer from much anti-Semitism, I could remember all the times my brothers came home with bloody noses for having fought. And my experience in school was that the first day we arrived there, it was in October, and my mother, I remember what I was wearing, and I didn't get up early in the morning, and I stood outside the store as the children were coming home from school. And they looked at me and looked at me, and they made a circle around me, and one of them finally said, "She doesn't have horns."
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I don't have a question. Is it on? I don't have a question, but I can just tell you a bit of my experience. My parents grew up in a little town called Low Farm, which is 10 miles west of Morris. My father was a grain farmer there, and my grandparents had a country general store. We lived in the upper floor. And I was living there until grade 4 when we moved to Winnipeg. And my mother's side came from Brunkill, Manitoba, which is famous because of the flood. And they also had a country general store, and they lived upstairs above the store too. It's a sort of a standard design, I guess. But for Yom Tovim, for the Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we used to come into Winnipeg to go to the synagogue that was in the orphanage. There was a synagogue there, and I can still remember if you snuck into where the kids lived, you could, that institutional smell of the cleaning, whatever it was. And we kept kosher. Both families kept kosher, and we had to import the food from Winnipeg, from the butchers, and it either came out by bus or train, or you went into Winnipeg, picked it up yourself. Thank you. David Rosner is my name.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to let Dan wind up the program, and then we can go downstairs for refreshments.
Very much, Hannah. Thank you very much, David, Sid, Lillian, and Bruce. Thank you to the commentators and questioners from the audience. I'd also like to thank Temple Shalom for letting us use this fine facility, Judy Hubner and Steve in the back there. And I thank Stan Carbone, the Director of Programs and Exhibits, for putting this, like so many other programs, together, and Bill Jarniewski, our Executive Director, who supervises all this and keeps us going. I invite you at the Asper campus to see the exhibit that has been opened in little bits and pieces, and it's now is complete. Is it absolutely complete, or is there one element still to be mounted on women's organizations and their role in the Jewish community, something which has often been overlooked or at least insufficiently recognized. We're very happy to do this. Ladies Auxiliaries, Hadassah, National Council of Jewish Women, and others. So please, when you're on the Asper campus, take a look at our exhibit windows down the hall from the Bernie Theater. November. We don't have anything much planned in October. As far as I know, November is Holocaust Education Month, and there'll be a number of programs which will be advertised. The one that I'm personally involved in is a program on Herman Mollerman, who was a member of Temple Shalom before his death at age 90 in 1995. He was also a member of Shaare Zedek. A German Jew with a dramatic escape from Germany on the eve of the war. On other events, he ended up in a Canadian internment camp. There were 2,500 roughly German Jews who were sent to internment camps for 2 to 3 years here in Canada, plus I think slightly larger number to Australia. Then he was in the small town Belt, the Jewish small town Belt in eastern Saskatchewan, where he continued his career, his pre-war career of community leading and teaching, and retired to Winnipeg. That will be at the very end of November.
There will also be 2 more programs. One community program, which will be a feature film, The Last Twins, on the 9th. And on the 10th, Carol Matus will be launching her newest book called Stern Unleashed.
If you didn't hear that, Carol Matus book launch on November 10th. And sorry, what was the other one? The community. Okay.
Pardon? No, not yet. It hasn't been sent. None of this has been sent out yet. It is in November, but it will be. So a book launch with Carol Matus, her latest book, and a film. That's on the 10th, and on the 9th there'll be a film, but you'll hear much more about it as time goes on. The film, The Last Twins.
So, thank you all very much. Please join us downstairs for some refreshments, and also take advantage of the sunshine.